We are in a series, as the series intro indicated, in the series called The Real Jesus. And what are we doing with The Real Jesus? We're actually going through the book of John, which is found in the New Testament. We're digging deeper into who Jesus really is to get a fuller understanding of who it is written by who many consider was Jesus' best friend, John. And so what we've been doing is we've been working through it chapter by chapter and looking in Jesus' life. And we want to know who he is. We want to understand it. We want to know, is our picture of who Jesus is, does it fit who John says that he is? And today, we've made it all the way to John 19. There's only 21 chapters in the book of John, so we are almost there, folks. So, and if you're just joining us, right, or maybe you've missed a week or two, right, we're actually up to the moment that Jesus goes to the cross. And that's actually what we're going to be looking at today. And I encourage you, if you haven't been journeying with us, to go back and to watch as we've explored John 1 through 18, because I think it allows us to get so much more background, so much more context, so that when we read things like we read today, my hope is that you'll be able to see it from a different lens. And no matter how many times you've read this or how many times you've heard the story, because, John 19 explores the death of Jesus from his sentencing through his burial. And I think one of my fears in life is that I'm going to get too familiar with this moment in Jesus' life, that the danger is that I may become complacent to it. It's like when you listen to a song that you really like and you listen to it over and over and over again. At some point, you just kind of get sick of the song. I mean, you'll still listen to it when it comes on, but it's kind of lost that luster, right? Because if you've ever, been to a church or maybe you've never been, or maybe, you just come every once in a while, you're not even quite sure how you feel about this whole God thing, right? Chances are you've heard the story of Jesus going to the cross. So here's what I want us all to do. I want us to take a moment, and for those of you who've been with us for the last few months, and we've been, journeying through this together, I want you to think about the real Jesus that we've talked about and that we've walked with up until this moment. Right? So think about it. We've talked about how this Jesus, right? This Jesus is the one who called his 12 disciples to follow him. And he took alongside fishermen and tax collectors alongside them to teach them and help them to follow him well. Jesus also turned water into wine. This is the same Jesus who flipped tables over in the temple's court because he was so passionate about his Father's name. This is the same Jesus who shows compassion to a Samaritan woman and therefore changes her entire life as well as changing an entire town. This is the same Jesus who healed a man who couldn't walk for nearly four decades and miraculously gave him the ability to walk. This is the same Jesus who miraculously fed 5,000 individuals with just 2 fish and 5 loaves of bread. This is the same Jesus who walked on water, the same Jesus who gave sight to not one but 2 blind men. The same Jesus who raised Lazarus from the dead, the same Jesus who predicted his own death, who would wash his disciples' feet despite knowing that one of them would betray them, one of them would deny him 3 times, and many of them would desert him at the end. Jesus has shown that he is loyal and compassionate and brave and humble and honest and protective and encouraging. He shows that he likes to laugh and has a good time. We're told that he calls us his friend and he's promised to protect you. And all he's asked in return is that you trust him and that he is who he says he is and was sent by God. We look at all of this. And hopefully this will help us to give us fresh ears and fresh eyes to be able to experience this chapter that we're about to talk with today. So knowing all of that, remembering who this Jesus is, let's start chapter 19, verse 1. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head. They clothed him in a purple robe, and they went up to him again and again, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they slapped him in the face. See, Pontius Pilate, that's the Pilate that they talk about at the beginning. He had actually just got done telling the crowd, "I find no fault in this man," and then he has him flogged. So during this time, they would use something that's called a flagrum that kind of looks like this, right? And this device is what the Romans would use to flog somebody. As you can see, it's many leather straps, and those little things, that's actually bone fragments. In some cases, being flogged could actually cause a person to die just by doing that. And if that wasn't enough, Jesus would be mocked and he would wear a crown of thorns on his head. And then they put a purple robe on him. Everything about this moment was intended to humiliate Jesus. We've already seen and we've walked through it how the religious leaders mocked him for claiming that he was the Messiah. And now the Romans have kind of jumped in to mock him as quote-unquote king. And why a purple robe? Well, the purple robe was a sign. Purple was used by kings and rulers. And again, it was all intended to be a cruel picture and a mocking picture of him. And so the story continues in verse 5. When Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said to them, "Here is the man." As soon as the chief priests and their officials saw him, they shouted, "Crucify, crucify." But Pilate answered, "You take him and crucify him. As for me, I find no basis for a charge against him." And the Jewish leaders insisted, "We have a law, and according to that law, he must die, because he claimed to be the Son of God." When Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid. He went back inside the palace. "Where do you come from?" he asked Jesus. But Jesus gave him no answer. "Do you refuse to speak to me?" Pilate said. "Don't you realize I have the power to either free you or crucify you?" Jesus answered, "You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." From then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free. But the Jewish leaders kept shouting, "If you let this man go, you are no friend to Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar." When Pilate heard this, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judge's seat at a place known as the Stone Pavement, which in Aramaic is Gabbatha. It was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about noon. "Here is your king," Pilate said to the Jews. But they shouted, take him away, crucify him." "Shall I crucify your king?" Pilate asked. "We have no king but Caesar," the chief priests answered. And finally, Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified. So the soldiers took charge of Jesus. So Pilate presents Jesus to the crowd now that he's been beaten and mocked and he's covered in blood and sweat and spit. And Pilate, Pilate's an interesting character. Pilate, sometimes we read this and we don't know how to feel about him. Right? No matter how many times I read this story, it's still not fully clear what he really thought or how he really felt. Pontius Pilate, all right, is called the governor of Judea in Scripture, and his actual title was prefect. I think governor just sounded better, right? And so they were usually assigned to these small territories that needed close watching. So whenever the Jewish people had a large gathering in Jerusalem specifically, he would travel there to make sure that everything stayed under control. That was the job of these Roman governors, right? To keep things under control, to collect taxes, and just to keep the peace. Now, it makes sense that we would find Pilate in Jerusalem because this is the Passover season. That would mean Jewish people from all over would be coming to Jerusalem for the Passover. And so this gives you to give you a clear picture of where we're at timeline-wise. Jesus had been arrested around midnight on Thursday. And then throughout the evening, he has a hearing with the high priests, and finally he goes before the Sanhedrin, which is like the Jewish Supreme Court. They tried him. They gave him the charge of blasphemy because he was claiming to be God. And blasphemy, according to the Jewish law, was punishable by death. And that's really what they wanted, right? An execution. They didn't care about a trial. Why else do they think they did it in the middle of the night? But there was one hitch. The Jewish people could condemn a man to death, but guess what? They couldn't carry it out. The Roman people had actually taken that right away from the Jewish people. So before Jesus could be put to death, Pilate had to agree to it, which is why on Friday morning, where we are, they bring Jesus to Pilate. And even after questioning Jesus and learning about why he was in front of him, Pilate says, "I see no reason to execute this man." It even says in verse 12 that he kept trying to set Jesus free. But all the times the religious leaders were pressing him and telling him to crucify him. In fact, if you go to all the gospel accounts, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, right, it appears that Pilate tried 4 times to avoid sentencing Jesus to death. First, He told them to try the case themselves. Second, he told them he was going to send the case to Herod. Third, he thought maybe like by flogging Jesus, that'll be enough. And then fourth, there was actually a moment that you read in one of the accounts where he offers to free a prisoner, either Jesus or this man Barabbas. And the Jewish people decided to free Barabbas. So I think for all the pressure, Pilate would have probably only released Jesus, right? If, maybe with just that beating, with just that flogging, he probably would have just said, I don't really care. I'm just going to release him anyway, except for this one thing that the religious leaders did. In a way, they kind of played their ace. And their ace was found in verse 12. It says, from then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free, but the Jewish leaders kept shouting, if you let this man go, you're no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar. And Pilate knew exactly what they meant. Essentially, this was blackmail, pure and simple. And it worked. You see, because if the choice was simply between Jesus and the religious leaders, Pilate would probably have let Jesus go. But that's not exactly what happened. The blackmail now made it a choice between Jesus and Rome. And a man will do anything to save his own butt. So in the end, it came down to pure self-interest on Pilate's part. It came down to a lesson, really, I think, in determination. Because the Jewish leaders, the Jewish religious leaders, were so determined to get rid of this Jesus problem that they had, right? That they would have done anything in order to get him executed. They didn't care about Jesus. All they cared about was themselves. They were determined to get rid of him. They knew how to play Pilate. They knew exactly what they needed to do. We spent so much time early on exploring how the Pharisees and the other religious leaders were desperately trying to hold on to their position. They were determined to be the religious authority. They were determined to be the ones who called the shots when it came to matters of God. And if you look at this, Pilate was determined as well. It may have seemed initially like he was determined to set Jesus free, but it was only because it didn't seem like he would have to take a personal stand. So how was Pilate determined? Well, Pilate was determined to save his position. He was determined not to upset Rome. Because remember, Pilate was just the governor. There's still an emperor that he would have to deal with. And if your only job, you only had one job, that was to keep the peace. But realizing that if you'd let Jesus go, there could be an uprising of religious leaders and of Jewish people. If he decides to set Jesus free, then he could very well lose his status and he could very well lose his position. So he was determined to save himself. So now you've got these two forces determined to see their own outcome. The religious leaders are determined to see Jesus dead, and the Roman forces are determined to keep the peace. So what happens? Well, Jesus is sent to be crucified. Verse 17, carrying his own cross, he went out to the place of the skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. There they crucified him, and with him two others, one on each side, and Jesus in the middle. Now, I'm going to preface this, because I was told I should, that I'm going to go into a little bit of detail about what a crucifixion is. Why? I think it's important that you understand what Jesus endured. So, if you don't like Grey's Anatomy or Chicago Med, okay, like you might want to pop in an earbud or go get a donut or something like that. And I'll do like an indication or something. I'll make something to let you know that it's safe to tune back in, okay? But I think it's important. So anyway, it says Jesus was forced to carry a wooden beam, right? The wooden beam to the place of his crucifixion. This is the beam. This beam would have been extremely heavy. And if you can imagine that Jesus would have been immensely weak based upon the beating that he just had. So then when he got to this place, right, to Golgotha, Jesus was then nailed to the horizontal beam while still flat on the ground. And then with his wrists nailed to the horizontal beam, the beam would then be lifted and then hammered into the vertical beam. When that happened, Jesus' feet would still not be nailed to the vertical beam. It was only when he was up that Jesus' feet would be nailed, causing Jesus, as he hung on the cross, then were his knees to be bent at a 45-degree angle, which meant that he had to sustain the weight of his body with just the thigh muscles. They wouldn't let me, but I wanted to take all the chairs away and see if you could do it. It's painful. It's painful to bend the knees and support one's weight with the thighs for just even a few minutes. Imagine doing this for hours. And so the natural way for our vital organs to receive oxygen then is because of the flow of blood, right? And so proper movement of the arms and the legs and their interaction with gravity is kind of what enables that process. So the cross literally prevents Jesus from natural movement. And so the stationary arms and legs combined with gravity's force of pulling the blood downward actually prevents the vital organs from receiving the proper flow of oxygen. And so these organs kind of respond to this unnatural position by sending warning signs to the brain that, hey, something's wrong. And the warning signals are sent through the nerves that lead to these pain centers of our brain. So with all these other excruciating tortures that his body's endured on the cross, now the oxygen-deprived organs are sending these unimaginable pain signals to the brain. And here's the crazy thing. These things did not just happen in sequence, one right after the other, so that Jesus would have time to prepare. No. Every single bodily response to the crucifixion happened at the exact same time. And so the combined effect of all of these things happening to the body at once is just beyond comprehension. The pain and the suffering were indescribable. Okay, you can take out your earbuds now. But what's heartbreaking about this whole thing? I mean, there's many things heartbreaking about it, but I think one of the other things that's heartbreaking about this is the whole time his mother, his aunt, his friend, his best friend, were watching this horrific ordeal. Verse 25, near the cross of Jesus stood his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother there and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to her, "Woman, here is your son." And to the disciple, "Here is your mother." From that time on, this disciple took her into his home. It's just so difficult to comprehend the agony of Mary as she saw her son crucified. She was there to witness the pain and the humiliation and the shame and the suffering and his death. And that phrase where it says, the disciple whom he loved, was the way that John, our author, would refer to himself. And I think it's so important to note this because now we know that John was actually there at the crucifixion of Jesus. He watched these things happen with his own eyes and he recorded them down. He wasn't given information by someone else. He saw it for himself. And this is also how we know that John was one of Jesus' best friends. Because who are you going to trust your own mother with? Only one of the closest. And so now the only thing is that Jesus must end it all while they're on the cross. Verse 28, later, knowing that everything had been finished, and so Scripture would be fulfilled, Jesus said, "I'm thirsty." A jar of wine vinegar was there, so they soaked a sponge in it and put the sponge on a stalk of hyssop plant and lifted it to Jesus' lips. When he received the drink, Jesus said, "It is finished." With that, he bowed his head and gave us his spirit. So you saw the determination of the Pharisees and the religious leaders trying to get rid of Jesus. And you saw the determination of Pilate in trying to keep the peace and not rock the boat and save his job. But what I would hope that you haven't missed from this account is that you haven't missed the determination of Jesus. Because Jesus was so determined to do the will of his Father, so determined to complete the mission that he was here on this earth to do, that he endured all that pain, all that torture, and all that humiliation. And why did he do it? Why was he so determined? What was he determined for? He was determined for you. He was determined for me. He was determined to save us from our sins. He was determined to make a way for you to live with him in eternity. He was determined to make a way so that you could be with him forever. That's the determination of Christ. To do the will of his Father. He didn't have to. At any point, he could have been like, time out, this is too much, I'm done. But he didn't. Because he knew what needed to be done in order to bring you into the family. And I hope that as we look through these different eyes of determination, that we see something. Because I don't know about you, but I found myself being determined in the ways of the Pharisees. Like, I'm not proud of it, but in my own life, I've been that way. And maybe you have too, where you have been so determined to get what you want that you're willing to do anything in order to make it happen, even if it isn't always to tell the truth. Or maybe your determination sometimes looks like Pilate, right? You're determined to keep your status. You're determined to keep your job. You're determined to keep your way of life, no matter what the cost. Or have I ever had the determination of Jesus? One where I am so sold out to what God has asked of me, that I am so connected to the Father that I wake up daily and I say, you know what, God? Not my will, but your will be done. And I think if I'm honest, and I think if we're honest with ourselves, our determination in life fluctuates between many of those. Or somewhere in between. Jesus was determined to do the will of God no matter what surrounded him, no matter what was thrown at him. And you saw it in his life. If you've been walking with us, you saw that he was determined to heal the sick. He was determined to heal the blind, the deaf, as well as raise the dead. He was determined to lead people back into the love of God. Jesus was and continues to be determined to reach and save people. Jesus was determined to get to that point when he could give up his spirit and say, "It is finished." And when he gets there, what is finished? Well, on the surface, we can say that, it's merely his death, all that anguish, the agony that he experienced, right? Being whipped, beaten, crown of thorns, and now he's hung up to be crucified, right? All of that was finished. But this phrase, it is finished. It's actually a single word in Aramaic, and I want to thank Justin for pointing this part out to me, because, it's finished. The actual word in Aramaic, which is the language that Jesus would have spoken, is this word mashalem. Mashalem. All right, mashalem comes from the root word shalem, which is actually the same root word for shalom, which means peace. Right? And so in Aramaic, it means submission or complete submission or complete determination. In other words, through Jesus' determination and complete submission to the Father's will, the ability for us to live in peace with God was now possible. Mashalem means it is finished. And because it is finished, you may now walk into the presence of the Lord and experience peace once again because of Jesus Christ's complete submission and complete determination. I'm going to start saying this when I finish things. Like, one of the things I hate doing is putting furniture together. I can't stand it. Don't ask me to go to IKEA with you. I'll go for the meatballs, but that's it. But I can't stand it. I can't stand it. So maybe it'll make me feel better about myself when I finish it. I can be like, Mashalem! And that's what it is about that phrase. Because you know what happens is that we get to this story. We get to this story and we say it all the time on Good Friday, right? We get to Good Friday, we get to the death on the cross, and it's always so somber, and it's always so sad, and it's always so, oh, it is finished and Jesus died on the cross. And yes, there's part of that. That's one of the reasons why I wanted to paint the picture of the crucifixion, and one of the reasons I wanted you to see exactly what Jesus Christ went through for you so that you and he could, so that you can be reconciled to God. I think that is so important for us to reflect on and to remember. It's part of why we take communion every single week, to remember that his body was broken for us, to remember that his blood was shed for us, right? There is something healthy in remembering that, but there is also something powerful about remembering what was finished. If we went into every day realizing, no, it is finished, it doesn't become this somber thing, oh, it is finished. No, Mashalem, it is finished. It becomes a cry of hope. And what is finished? What was finished? Yes, Jesus finished the task that God had given him. Jesus made sure that justice had been served for our sin, right? Jesus completely paid our debt, right? Jesus' sacrifice made it possible for us to be redeemed from our sin. Jesus' death on the cross was the sacrifice for our sin. I remember as a new believer, I walked into this relationship with Jesus when I was in graduate school, about 23, and I used to ask my pastor in Alabama a lot of questions. And I remember one day, early on, I was wrestling with my faith. This was all new to me. I didn't think I was good enough. I was ashamed of my past. I was ashamed of the things that I had done and even the things that I would continue to do. And I remember asking him once, and maybe it's a question that you have asked too, but I remember going to him like, what do I have to do to be saved? And he looks at me and he goes, I'm sorry, Anthony, you're too late. And I was like, rude. But I was like, what? What do you mean? And he said, 2,000 years ago on that cross, it was already done for you. That's what Mashalem means. In Greek, it actually means tetelestai, which means it is finished. And this one single word is really what separates Christianity from every other religion on the planet. All the other religions are about what you need to do to get right with God, but Jesus says, it is finished. Jesus says, it is finished. And here's the crazy thing about it. And maybe it's okay that we know the story. Maybe it's okay that we know the ending. Maybe it's okay that we know that after Jesus dies on the cross, 3 days later, he comes back and he doesn't stay dead. It's important that we understand that, because it is finished then becomes more of an opportunity to celebrate what he's done. And I think what happens is that we can get so complacent with the story of who Jesus is, and we can get so complacent of what Jesus Christ did on the cross for us, and we can hear it over and over and over again, and we don't let it actually get inside of us. And yes, there's some of us that there's some of us that have walked into this relationship with Jesus and we realized, oh my gosh, what did you do for me? And there are some of us that are here today or watching online, you're not quite sure yet. You're not quite sure based on some things that you've done or some things that you've heard or some things that maybe you've experienced. But Jesus is saying, you know what? I've finished that too. It is finished. And so today, I just ask you, do you believe that? Do you receive that? Will you stop trying to earn your way with God? Because you can't. You can't. It's finished. It is finished. We now know what Jesus made possible on that cross, and we know that he rose again. We know what happens. And sometimes we have such a hard time accepting what God did for us because we're so focused on certain things, right? Like sometimes we have such a hard time accepting what God did for us because we're not sure if we can trust him. We have such a hard time accepting what God did for us because we're not sure if he's good. Well, guess what? He didn't have to send Jesus. He didn't have to go to the cross. He's God. But he did. He sent Jesus to save us, not because we're good. He did that because he's good. And here's what's crazy about it. He says, when you say yes to Jesus, he looks you straight in the eye and he says, you know what? Now you're good. He literally says we receive the righteousness of Christ when we put our faith and trust and believe that Jesus took our place for his sins, which means he looks at you and he says, guess what? You're good. We're good. It is finished. I think there's no sweeter words than that. There's no sweeter words than it is finished. What if we looked at it is finished as that cry of hope, as that cry of freedom, as that cry of gratefulness, that we give thanks to him for doing what we never could, that for loving us and going to the cross despite our rebellion. That is my prayer, that we proclaim that it is finished and that we believe that once and for all and we stop trying to strive to do something to earn it because there's nothing we can do. He did it. It is finished. But what we can do is go back to the determination of Christ and wake up every morning and say, Father, okay, because what you have endured, because of what you did for me, I want your will to be done. And when we do that, that's when he starts working. And more people come to know who this God is. And that he is so good. Will you pray with me? Father, I am so thankful for what you've done. And that is my prayer today, God, that we won't get so used to this story that we will forget what it truly means, what it truly signifies. What you went through, what had to take place in order for us to have hope, in order for us to experience freedom. And that's what you want us to experience. So many times, even after we've said yes to you, we continue to beat ourselves up. We continue to try to nail ourselves to the cross. When the reality is that you've already done it and it's already been paid for. And you've called us to live in that freedom. And so my prayer today is twofold. For those that are here today or watching online, God, that are struggling to trust you, that don't know if you are good, God, that you will just soften their hearts just a little bit more so they can take that step and realize, yes, they can even trust him. That yes, they sent Jesus, that you sent Jesus for them. And it doesn't matter what they've done, it doesn't matter where they've been, that you are pursuing them and that you want to have a relationship and that you said it is finished for them too. And then I pray for those of us who've walked into this relationship with you, that have said yes to you. Father, I pray that will live inside of us and that we will boldly be able to proclaim that it is finished, and we will stop trying and start living in that freedom and waking up every morning saying, God, your will is so much better than mine. That's my prayer. And it's all because of Jesus. And it's in his name we pray. Amen.